Welcome to this quiet journey through the new California Republic. Tonight, we'll drift through the long story of a nation reborn from the ashes, exploring the ideals, struggles, and secrets that shaped its people. From the early settlers of Shady Sands to the battle-worn soldiers of Hoover Dam, the Republic's history mirrors humanity's own search for order after chaos. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you enjoy these calm explorations, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. The new California Republic began not with soldiers or politicians, but with survivors. In the years after the Great War, small groups of people gathered near the ruins of Los Angeles, seeking shelter, food, and stability. Among them was a town called Shady Sands, a quiet settlement built around irrigation farms and broken remnants of pre-war technology. It was here that the first foundations of the Republic took root, driven by the belief that civilization could return. What began as a few families and traders soon became a beacon of hope for wanderers who had grown tired of chaos. The Republic's earliest leader was a woman named Aradesh, a former resident of Vault 15 who helped found Shady Sands after leaving the vault, who believed that the only way to rebuild was through cooperation. His daughter, Tandy, would later become one of the most influential figures in Fallout's entire history. Tandy inherited her father's ideals, but shaped them into something greater. She believed that the wasteland could not survive without structure, and that structure required laws, borders, and unity. Under her leadership, the people of Shady Sands began to call themselves citizens, forming what would one day be known as the new California Republic. The Republic's first constitution was modeled loosely after that of the old United States. It established a Senate, a president, and regional governors. Many of the early lawmakers had little understanding of true governance, but they believed that symbols mattered. To see a government rise from the dust meant that civilization itself had not died. Their first flag bore the image of a two-headed bear, adapted from the old Californian grizzly. The second head symbolized duality, the balance between strength and caution, aggression and reason. It also hinted at mutation, a reminder that this was not the same world that had fallen before. In its early years, the NCR focused on rebuilding trade routes across Southern California. Caravan guards became the first unofficial army, protecting merchants from raiders and mutants. Eventually, these guards evolved into the NCR Rangers, a highly respected branch dedicated not only to defense, but also to justice. The Rangers' code emphasized fairness, restraint, and protection of the innocent. They became legends throughout the wasteland, known for their loyalty and their dusty longcoats that billowed like ghosts across the desert. The city of Shady Sands transformed into the Republic's capital, later renamed simply NCR City. Its growth was extraordinary, fueled by agriculture, organized trade, and a new sense of security. As crops flourished and laws stabilized, more towns joined the Republic. Junktown, the Hub, and Dayglow all pledged allegiance, not through conquest, but through shared interest. The Republic's promise was simple protection and prosperity for those willing to follow its laws. In a world where chaos ruled, that offer was irresistible. Yet, from the beginning, cracks appeared. Expansion required resources, and resources bred greed. The Republic's senators often came from merchant families whose wealth gave them influence. Tandy, now president, found herself struggling to keep the dream alive amid growing political corruption. Still, her charisma and long life gave her almost mythic status. By the time of her final term, she had served for more than 100 years, her wisdom preserved through longevity enhancing technology. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of the founding flame into colder, more pragmatic hands. After Tandy, the Republic became increasingly bureaucratic. Its institutions grew rigid, its leaders more distant from the people. Citizens began to see the government not as a guardian, but as a machine. Taxes increased, laws multiplied, and soldiers replaced the idealistic rangers in maintaining order. Even so, the NCR remained one of the wasteland's few functioning democracies, a rare structure in a broken world. The NCR's military evolved from militia units into a formalized army. Its soldiers wore tan uniforms modeled after pre-war forces, though their equipment was often scavenged. Standard issue rifles, leather armor, and improvised vehicles gave the army a rough yet disciplined appearance. Despite their lack of high technology, they had one advantage: organization. While raiders fought for greed and the Brotherhood fought for relics, the NCR fought for control. Their structure allowed them to expand far beyond their origins, pushing eastward into territories untouched since the bombs fell. Their expansion brought them into conflict with the Brotherhood of Steel, whose hoarding of pre-war technology clashed with the NCR's belief that power should serve the many. The two sides first met in uneasy alliance, trading supplies and intelligence, but cooperation turned to hostility when the Brotherhood refused to share advanced weaponry. The resulting war was brutal but short-lived, leaving both sides weakened. To the NCR, the victory proved that democracy could triumph over secrecy. To the Brotherhood, it confirmed their fear that humanity's return to power would only repeat old mistakes. The Republic's government was built on 5 branches: the presidency, the Senate, the courts, the Rangers, and the Army. The president acted as both head of state and commander in chief, while the Senate passed laws and managed regional affairs. The courts were weak in the early years, but grew in influence as the Republic expanded, eventually forming a system of circuit judges who traveled between settlements. These traveling magistrates became minor celebrities, bringing justice to places where law had never existed before. Their verdicts often shaped local politics as much as national ones. As the Republic spread, so did its bureaucracy. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, the NCR controlled vast stretches of land, from Shady Sands to the Mojave. This growth stretched their resources thin, forcing them to rely on conscripts and overworked officials. Taxes became a source of resentment, especially among frontier settlers who felt abandoned. To those outside the capital, the Republic no longer looked like a protector, it looked like an empire. Despite its flaws, the NCR preserved some of the best traits of the old world. It built schools, maintained hospitals, and promoted education. It even printed currency, the NCR dollar, backed by gold reserves from pre-war vaults. But inflation and counterfeiting quickly undermined confidence in the money. In the Mojave, caps remained the preferred form of trade, reminding everyone that civilization was still fragile, no matter how proud its symbols appeared. NCR soldiers, while disciplined, often found themselves fighting enemies they did not understand. Super mutants, raider tribes, and desert cults all resisted their expansion, yet it was their clash with Caesar's legion that defined the Republic's modern history. The legion's brutality and order mirrored the NCR's bureaucracy and democracy, creating a mirror image of civilization, one built on freedom, the other on domination. The battle for Hoover Dam became the test of which vision would inherit the wasteland. The NCR flag, with its two-headed bear and single star, flies in countless settlements, painted on walls and banners. Each version looks slightly different, hand-drawn or faded, as if every citizen imagines the Republic in their own way. That is perhaps its greatest strength and weakness. It is both an idea and an institution, both hope and hypocrisy. In every Fallout story that touches the NCR, the same question lingers. Can humanity rebuild without repeating the same mistakes that destroyed it? From a small farm in shady sands to the vast armies that march under its flag, the New California Republic stands as Fallout's greatest experiment in civilization. It embodies the tension between idealism and control, compassion and power. Its citizens plant crops in radioactive soil, vote under banners of tarnished gold, and tell their children that the future is worth fighting for. And in the quiet moments between wars and politics, the Republic remains what it always was, a fragile promise that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. As the new California Republic expanded beyond its birthplace in shady sands, its leaders began to see both opportunity and risk stretching across the horizon. What started as scattered settlements now formed a chain of alliances connected by dusty roads and shared ambition. The Republic's caravans became lifelines, carrying food, medicine, and law into regions long ruled by raiders. Merchants wore the bear's insignia as proudly as soldiers, for trade and security were inseparable. The more people the NCR protected, the more citizens it gained, and with every new settlement came another piece of the Republic's growing puzzle. During these decades of expansion, the Republic's political structure solidified into something recognizable as government. The Senate was composed of elected officials from each major region, but elections were often influenced by wealth. Families who had profited from trade or resource control gained seats and used them to shape policy. Over time, this created a class divide between the well-connected citizens of the core territories and the frontier settlers who lived under constant threat. The dream of democracy endured, but it became more difficult to tell whether votes or money held greater power. To many citizens, Tandi's name still symbolized unity, even after her death. Her statues stood in the centers of cities, and her speeches were preserved on holotape for civic gatherings. In one address recorded near the end of her life, she warned, "Freedom is like fire. It can warm or destroy. Guard it with wisdom." Generations later, her words still echoed through the Republic's halls, though the people who repeated them often misunderstood her meaning. What she saw as caution, others used as justification for control. It was one of many ironies that came to define the NCR's later years. The Republic's expansion relied heavily on the NCR Rangers, who served as both peacekeepers and explorers. These men and women operated beyond the edges of law, bringing order to the frontier by reputation as much as by force. The Rangers' symbol, a single star, represented their independence and loyalty to the people rather than to the bureaucracy. Their headquarters in the hub became a sanctuary for idealists and wanderers alike. Though small in number, they earned the respect of friend and foe. When a ranger walked into a settlement, raiders often left before the first shot was fired. Their quiet authority carried the weight of legend. As the Republic stretched north and east, it began to absorb territories once held by independent groups. Junktown and the Hub became formal provinces, while settlements like Dayglow contributed technological knowledge gleaned from old world ruins. In Dayglow, survivors of pre-war military research shared techniques for solar energy and desalination, helping the Republic restore farmland devastated by radiation. These advances gave the NCR a rare advantage: the ability to sustain population growth through infrastructure rather than conquest. Yet every improvement drew envy and opposition from those who preferred the chaos of the old wasteland. The Republic's capital, NCR City, transformed into a bustling metropolis. Pre-war ruins were repurposed into government buildings, and streets once lined with dust now thrummed with the sound of commerce. Air filtration systems reduced radiation in the inner districts, allowing gardens and fountains to flourish. To the average citizen, life in NCR City represented civilization's return, but beneath the surface, political intrigue brewed. Senators traded favors behind closed doors, and lobbyists for merchant guilds whispered promises of wealth. The dream of the Republic was alive, but so were the ghosts of greed that had destroyed the world before it. To maintain order across its vast lands, the Republic introduced standardized education. Schools taught children to read, count, and understand basic governance. History lessons glorified the Republic's founders, portraying them as saviors of humanity. While these teachings inspired loyalty, they also erased the complexities of the past. Tandy's cautious idealism became mythic perfection, and the harsh realities of survival were softened into patriotic tales. Over time, the Republic's story became less about truth and more about faith, a new religion of democracy built upon selective memory. The NCR's military grew rapidly during this period, evolving into one of the most organized forces in the post-war world. Recruitment drives offered citizenship to outsiders willing to serve, and entire families joined for food and security. The Army adopted rank insignias, uniforms, and command structures modeled on the pre-war United States Army. Though equipment shortages persisted, the soldiers' discipline gave them a reputation for reliability. Their greatest strength lay not in their weapons, but in their belief that they fought for something larger than themselves. The Republic's engineers rebuilt major roadways, restoring sections of the old interstate network. This project, known as the Reclamation Route, connected settlements from Shady Sands to the Mojave frontier. Along its path, trade posts and way stations sprouted, each flying the NCR flag. These roads were more than infrastructure, they were arteries through which civilization flowed. Travelers spoke of seeing the Republic's patrols at dusk, their silhouettes framed by the glow of campfires and the sound of distant wind, a reminder that even in the wasteland, order could move like a heartbeat through the dust. But not all regions welcomed the Republic's expansion. The Mojave, with its independent settlements and deep cultural roots, resisted assimilation. Towns like Prim and Novak viewed the NCR as outsiders, bringing bureaucracy instead of freedom. Some saw them as the very empire they once claimed to oppose. These tensions foreshadowed the conflicts that would later erupt at Hoover Dam and beyond. To the NCR's leaders, expansion was destiny. To many others, it was invasion. The Republic's banners promised stability, yet behind them marched tax collectors and conscription officers. The Republic's relationship with the Brotherhood of Steel deteriorated further during these years. While the NCR sought to distribute technology for the benefit of the masses, the Brotherhood hoarded it for preservation. Skirmishes turned into open war when NCR patrols attempted to seize energy weapons from Brotherhood caches. Despite suffering heavy losses, the NCR's superior numbers overwhelmed the Brotherhood's isolationist chapters in California. Yet the cost was high, leaving both sides scarred and distrustful. The aftermath marked one of the Republic's darkest victories, a triumph that eroded the moral foundation it claimed to defend. Economic growth brought its own troubles. As the republic expanded, corruption followed. Wealth concentrated among powerful merchant dynasties who influenced policy through bribes and favors. The Senate, once envisioned as the voice of the people, became a stage for competing interests. Ordinary citizens often found their petitions buried beneath piles of bureaucracy. Even so, the Republic endured, fueled by inertia and habit as much as by hope. In many ways, it mirrored the old United States, ambitious, flawed, and endlessly determined to survive. The NCR's symbol, the two-headed bear, appeared on everything from military banners to coinage. To settlers, it represented unity between the old world and the new. To critics, it symbolized duality, one head looking to the past, the other devouring the future. The flag itself became a contested image. In frontier towns, it inspired loyalty; in conquered lands, resentment. Yet through all divisions, the bear endured, lumbering across history as the Republic's most enduring emblem. Diplomacy became a crucial part of NCR politics. Ambassadors traveled to far settlements, negotiating trade, water rights, and military alliances. The Republic's expansion into Nevada and the Mojave required delicate balance. Towns like Vault City and New Reno posed challenges. One prized isolation, the other vice. Negotiations with both often ended in uneasy compromise. In many cases, the Republic tolerated corruption and crime if it ensured stability, a decision that chipped away at the moral high ground Tandy had fought to preserve. As the Republic moved eastward, its soldiers began encountering remnants of old world experiments. Vaults containing mutated crops, failed cloning projects, and derelict robots became sources of both danger and discovery. Scientists working for the NCR Research Division salvaged pre-war data to improve medicine and engineering. Some of these findings were distributed freely, but others were classified. Whispers spread that the government had begun developing biological weapons in secret, though officials denied it. Whether true or not, such rumors revealed the growing mistrust between citizens and the state. Even in its most powerful years, the NCR remained fragile. Droughts strained its agriculture, raiders continued to plague trade routes, and border wars sapped morale. Yet through it all, the people kept building, kept believing. Each farm tilled, each town rebuilt, became another testament to human endurance. In the heart of the Republic, where the sun set over shady sands, citizens gathered in open squares, each evening to light lanterns, a ritual meant to honor the founders and remind themselves that even after 2 centuries of struggle, the light of civilization still burned. The Republic was no longer a settlement, no longer a dream whispered around campfires. It had become an institution, as enduring and imperfect as any that came before. Its story was not one of heroes alone, but of farmers, traders, soldiers, and clerks who refused to let the world end twice. In their hands, democracy survived not because it was flawless, but because it was the only thing left worth rebuilding. By the time the new California Republic reached its third generation of leadership, the balance between democracy and empire had begun to blur. The Republic's reach extended from the coastlines of the Pacific to the fringes of the Mojave, encompassing dozens of towns and nearly 1 million citizens. To many, this was proof that humanity could rebuild itself from ashes. But to those living far from shady sands, the Republic no longer looked like salvation. It looked like a bureaucracy that spoke of freedom but ruled with red tape. The government of the NCR had grown into a massive system of departments and ministries, each responsible for managing different aspects of post war life. The Department of Water and Agriculture oversaw irrigation and farming, ensuring that settlements could feed themselves. The Department of Defense coordinated the Army and Ranger divisions, while the Treasury managed the minting of the NCR dollar. Over time, each of these institutions developed its own hierarchies, competing for influence. The Senate struggled to maintain oversight, and the president often became the final arbiter between feuding branches of the government. President Aaron Kimball represented the Republic at its peak of power and controversy. Once a general, Kimball rose through the ranks with promises to restore stability to the frontier and bring order to the Mojave. His leadership was bold but divisive. He sought to expand the Republic's borders further east, dreaming of a united wasteland under the NCR banner. To his critics, this ambition looked less like unity and more like conquest. His policies emphasized military strength over diplomacy, a shift that transformed the Republic from a symbol of peace into a state driven by control. Under Kimball's administration, the NCR military underwent significant modernization. Factories in the core territories produced weapons, uniforms, and vehicles on a scale unseen since before the war. Soldiers received better rations, improved armor, and clearer chains of command. Training programs at Camp McCarran and Camp Forlorn Hope became the backbone of the NCR's new frontier army. Yet, for all its strength, morale remained fragile. Many troops were conscripts from poor border towns, and their loyalty was as thin as their pay. They fought not for ideals, but for survival. The conflict with Caesar's legion at Hoover Dam became the Republic's defining test. The dam represented more than power, it symbolized control of the Mojave's future. Whoever held it controlled electricity, trade, and the promise of civilization. When the NCR first arrived, they repaired the dam's turbines, restoring light to towns across Nevada. But maintaining that control required endless manpower, and the soldiers stationed along the Colorado River grew weary. Each skirmish with the Legion cost lives, resources, and faith in the Republic's purpose. At home, citizens watched the war unfold through rumors carried by caravans. They heard of Legion brutality, of villages enslaved and burned, and of NCR soldiers fighting heroically against impossible odds. But they also heard whispers of incompetence commanders sending men into hopeless battles, supplies vanishing before they reached the front, and officers more concerned with medals than survival. For the first time since its founding, the Republic's citizens began to question whether their leaders truly represented them. The illusion of unity faltered under the weight of distance and doubt. The Senate grew increasingly fractured during this time. Senators representing core cities like NCR City and the Hub prioritized stability and trade, while those from frontier regions demanded more protection and funding. Debates dragged for months, while soldiers died in the desert. Lobbyists for wealthy merchants and mining companies wielded influence far beyond their offices, shaping laws to serve profit. To ordinary citizens, the government's speeches about democracy began to sound hollow. A quiet cynicism spread through the Republic, not from rebellion but from exhaustion. Despite this unrest, the NCR continued to invest in civic projects. Engineers repaired ancient dams, reopened train lines, and even began experiments in radio broadcasting to link distant settlements. The Republic's technology lagged behind pre-war levels, but outpaced any rival. Education programs expanded, and for the first time, children born outside the core territories could attend government-funded schools. These efforts reinforced the idea that the Republic, however flawed, still offered a better life than chaos. For many, that was enough to believe in. The NCR Rangers remained the moral backbone of the Republic. Even as corruption spread through its political ranks, the Rangers held fast to their code of justice and restraint. Their loyalty lay not with politicians, but with the people. When orders from the Senate clashed with their ethics, they often acted independently, protecting civilians before bureaucracy. This independence sometimes led to tension between Rangers and Army officers, yet their reputation as incorruptible peacekeepers endured. To the weary citizens of the wasteland, the sight of a Ranger's duster was as reassuring as a sunrise. Among the Rangers, tales of the old Mojave outposts carried mythic weight. Camp Searchlight, Camp Gulf, and the Mojave Outpost became symbols of endurance, each representing a fragment of the Republic's frontier spirit. At the Mojave Outpost, two giant statues stood with hands clasped in greeting, a memorial to unity between the NCR and the Mojave territories. The gesture was intended to represent friendship, though years later, many viewed it as arrogance. What once looked like cooperation now felt like occupation. The meaning of symbols changed as time wore down idealism. The Republic's economy grew complex and unstable. Its gold-backed currency began to lose value as resources stretched thin. Merchants in the Mojave preferred bottle caps or barter, and entire towns operated outside official financial systems. Counterfeiting rings spread, and even honest traders questioned whether the Republic's money held any meaning. Some called the NCR dollar paper faith, useful only so long as people believed in it. This quiet erosion of confidence mirrored the moral uncertainty creeping through the nation's heart. Still, in the halls of NCR City, optimism persisted. Politicians spoke of new colonies, new industries, and the endless horizon beyond the Colorado River. To them, expansion was not greed, but destiny. They saw the Republic as the natural heir to the Old World, its bureaucracy a sign of progress rather than decay. Tandy's vision of democracy had become an empire in all but name, yet many citizens accepted it. After all, order, no matter how flawed, felt safer than chaos. As the war with Caesar's legion dragged on, the Republic began to rely increasingly on propaganda. Newspapers published stories of victory, even when battles were inconclusive. Posters depicted the two-headed bear standing triumphant over the legion's bull, a clear message of superiority. In cities and border towns alike, speeches filled with patriotic rhetoric echoed through public squares. Behind the optimism, though, a quieter truth festered. The Republic was bleeding resources faster than it could replenish them. The dream of peace through power was consuming itself. Meanwhile, within the Mojave, tensions between NCR forces and local residents intensified. Soldiers stationed far from home grew restless, while settlers resented taxes and conscription. Raiders exploited the unrest, attacking caravans and retreating into the desert before reinforcements could respond. Each failure deepened mistrust between citizens and their government. Some frontier communities began forming their own militias, refusing NCR authority altogether. These local uprisings rarely succeeded, but revealed a growing fracture between the Republic's image and its reality. The Rangers foresaw this decline long before politicians did. In confidential reports, they warned that the Republic's rapid expansion had outpaced its moral foundation. Their words went unheeded, buried under paperwork and pride. As a result, The NCR entered the Battle of Hoover Dam with strength on paper, but fatigue in its soul. The victory they claimed there would become both their greatest triumph and the beginning of their slow unraveling. For in conquering the Mojave, they had also conquered their own restraint. After the dam, the Republic stood at a crossroads. Its people remained proud but weary, its soldiers brave but disillusioned. The bear still walked upright, but its steps grew heavier. The story of the NCR was no longer about creation, but preservation, about holding on to ideals in a world determined to test them. Through it all, the two-headed bear continued to watch over the wasteland, both guardian and warning, a reminder that even noble dreams can grow monstrous if fed too long on ambition. In the years following the victory at Hoover Dam, the new California Republic appeared stronger than ever on the surface. The two-headed bear flew proudly over the Mojave, its army patrolled the highways, and its politicians declared the dawn of a new era of peace. But behind the speeches and banners, the Republic was struggling to hold itself together. Expansion had come at a cost, greater than gold or blood. It had eroded trust. The vast machinery of the Republic, once built to serve its people, now struggled under its own weight. The Senate grew increasingly divided between the conservative core regions and the restless frontier. Senators from Shady Sands and NCR City focused on maintaining stability and trade, while those representing the border territories demanded military aid and tax relief. Filibusters and political deadlock became common, and citizens who once believed in democracy began to see their leaders as distant figures arguing over words while lives were lost in the desert. Newspapers in the hub printed editorials calling it the paper war, a phrase that captured the frustration of the common man who fought for survival while politicians fought for speeches. Corruption, once whispered about, became impossible to ignore. Merchant families, mining barons, and caravan magnates grew so powerful that some senators acted as their direct representatives rather than as servants of the people. These elite circles controlled trade routes, tariffs, and access to critical resources such as water and ammunition. While the Republic prided itself on equality under law, wealth quietly redrew those laws behind closed doors. To the settlers who lived miles from the capital, the NCR's ideals of fairness and justice began to feel like relics of a dream that belonged to another generation. President Kimball's military campaigns left deep scars across the Republic. Though celebrated as a hero, he was also remembered as a man whose pride exceeded his wisdom. His policies drained the treasury, strained logistics, and spread the army too thin to effectively defend its borders. Desertion became common among the lower ranks, and several outposts simply vanished, their garrisons either killed by raiders or abandoning their posts. By the end of his term, morale among soldiers was at its lowest in decades. What once had been an army of ideals had become an army of necessity. The NCR Rangers, who had always held themselves apart from the regular military, found their independence increasingly threatened. Bureaucrats in the Department of Defense began issuing new regulations that forced the Rangers to report directly to military commanders. This decision was meant to centralize authority, but it alienated many Rangers who viewed it as a betrayal of their oath to the people rather than the government. Quietly, several veteran Rangers resigned or disappeared into the wasteland, unwilling to compromise their code for political obedience. The Republic lost some of its best defenders, not through war, but through neglect. Despite growing instability, the Republic continued to expand its propaganda efforts. Billboards in cities showed smiling families beneath the slogan, "Freedom, security, prosperity. Radios broadcast upbeat reports of economic recovery, even as food shortages persisted in the outer provinces. In Shady Sands, schools taught children songs praising the Republic's founders. The words were simple and hopeful, yet the tone had changed. What once inspired unity now felt like an attempt to silence doubt. Citizens began to sense the difference between pride and insistence, between loyalty freely given and loyalty demanded. The NCR's infrastructure, though impressive for a post war world, began to falter under neglect. Roads cracked, irrigation lines failed, and power plants shut down due to lack of maintenance. The once ambitious reclamation route, which connected the Western Territories to the Mojave, became dangerous again as patrols dwindled. Caravans were forced to hire private guards, often paying in food rather than currency. Trade continued, but it carried a quiet desperation, as if everyone knew that the Republic's reach had grown farther than its grasp. In the capital, the Senate commissioned massive construction projects meant to symbolize renewal. A new civic center was built from salvaged marble and reinforced steel, its halls echoing with speeches about destiny and progress. But outside the city walls, poverty increased. Refugees from the frontier flooded the streets, seeking protection and work. Some were veterans, others farmers displaced by raiders or drought. The Republic promised them aid, but delivered little. As the gap between promise and reality widened, so did resentment. Meanwhile, in the Mojave, the scars of war had not healed. The NCR occupied Hoover Dam, but the cost of maintaining control over the region drained resources. Towns like Novak and Prim continued to rely on NCR protection, yet patrols grew infrequent. Legion remnants prowled the desert, preying on isolated travelers. To the soldiers stationed there, victory had begun to feel hollow. The banners still waved, but the dream of a united wasteland had faded into routine survival. The men and women who fought for freedom now stood guard over fading ideals. Despite the tension, the Republic's scientific divisions made significant progress during this time. Researchers in Dayglow and the Boneyard developed water purification systems capable of removing trace radiation from natural sources. These advances extended life expectancy and reduced disease among citizens, especially in core territories. But outside the capital, few benefited. Corrupt officials sold purification units to private buyers, creating black markets for clean water. In the Republic's early years, technology had been a symbol of hope. Now it became another tool of inequality. The NCR's relationship with the Brotherhood of Steel continued to deteriorate. The surviving Brotherhood chapters, weakened by past wars, withdrew into isolation, refusing to engage with the Republic. For its part, the NCR declared the Brotherhood a rogue organization and authorized patrols to seize their technology, but without mutual trust, neither side could truly destroy or cooperate with the other. Their stalemate reflected a larger truth about the wasteland that knowledge and power remained trapped between fear and control. Amid political decay, small voices still called for reform. Activists and idealists in Shady Sands formed new civic movements demanding transparency and term limits for senators. They quoted Tandy's early speeches, reminding citizens that democracy depended on accountability. These reformers were often dismissed as dreamers, yet their influence spread quietly through universities and community halls. Even in its most cynical age, the Republic still produced citizens who believed that government could change for the better. In that belief, faint as it was, the spirit of the founders endured. In border territories like Baja and the outer Mojave, Whispers of independence began to grow louder. Local leaders argued that the Republic taxed their resources, but offered little protection in return. Small militias began using the old NCR bear flag, with one head scratched out, a subtle act of defiance, symbolizing division. Officials dismissed these groups as criminals, but their message resonated with settlers tired of distant rulers. For the first time since its founding, the Republic faced the possibility of fragmentation from within. The NCR dollar continued to lose value, accelerating economic decline. Inflation forced merchants to trade in caps or bartered goods. Wealthy cities like the Hub adapted easily, but rural settlements suffered. Farmers were paid in currency that could not buy grain, and wages lost meaning. Desperation drove crime rates higher, and black markets thrived under the shadows of official law. The Republic's strength had once been its unity, now it was its vulnerability. Even as its systems faltered, the Republic still saw itself as the world's last beacon of civilization. Its diplomats spoke in grand terms about destiny and duty. "We are the light of the West," one senator famously declared, though his words rang hollow to those living in darkness. What made the NCR unique among the factions of Fallout was not its perfection, but its humanity. It was flawed, ambitious, proud, and weary, an echo of the old world, struggling to decide whether it had learned from the past or merely repeated it with new flags. At the edge of the Republic's borders, rangers continued their lonely patrols, walking the fine line between peacekeeper and witness. They saw the truth others ignored: the empty towns, the fading farms, the silent radio towers broadcasting static where once there had been news. And yet, despite everything, they stayed, because in their hearts they believed that something worth saving still existed, even if the Republic itself had forgotten what that was. The two-headed bear still stood proud against the dying sun, its banner frayed but unfallen. Beneath it, the people of the NCR endured as they always had, not because their government was flawless, but because hope is harder to kill than empires. And in the long silence of the wasteland, that hope whispered still. By the time a generation had passed since the founding of the new California Republic, it had become more than a government. It was an idea, a story told around campfires by those who had never even seen Shady Sands. For many across the wasteland, the Republic represented civilization itself, a living memory of the old world's promise that law, order, and progress could still survive the ashes. But for those living within its borders, it had become something far more complicated. The Republic was now a machine, vast, powerful, and often blind to the lives it governed. Its influence stretched from the Pacific coast to the far reaches of the Mojave Desert, touching places it could barely sustain. Yet, like the world before the bombs, it continued to reach further, always convinced that expansion would bring salvation rather than collapse. The Senate's policies toward expansion became one of the most debated topics in the Republic's history. Early leaders saw new territories as vital to economic growth and political stability. Each annexation brought access to fresh resources, crops, water, and salvage, and offered new settlers the dream of protection under the Republic's flag. Yet the further they expanded, the thinner their control became. Patrols could not reach every town, taxes went uncollected, and promises of aid arrived too late or not at all. Many frontier towns began to rely on self-rule, effectively becoming semi-independent. The Republic's laws were still written there, but its voice grew faint beyond the reach of its caravans. At the heart of the NCR's expansion was its infrastructure. Engineers and settlers worked tirelessly to rebuild the highways that once linked pre-war California These routes, known collectively as the reclamation roads, became lifelines for trade. They were lined with caravan posts, military checkpoints, and ranger outposts that watched for raiders and mutant creatures. Convoys carrying food and ammunition traveled day and night, guarded by mercenaries and NCR troops. But over time, these roads also became symbols of the Republic's fragility. Every stretch of asphalt represented resources that could be stolen, taxed, or destroyed. Raiders saw opportunity, and the NCR's army found itself constantly repairing the same routes it had just secured. Caravan companies became powerful institutions in their own right. The Crimson Caravan Company, founded long before the NCR even existed, grew into one of the Republic's most influential corporations. It funded political campaigns, advised senators, and dictated trade policies that favored its interests. Small traders could barely compete, and many were forced into contracts that tied them permanently to the company's routes. Critics accused the Crimson Caravan of functioning like a private government within the Republic, a claim that was difficult to dispute when its guards outnumbered some NCR patrols. The company's success reflected the Republic's dependence on commerce, a strength that also became a chain. The Republic's economic system evolved with uneven results. In its early days, currency was backed by gold reserves discovered in pre-war vaults and mines. But as those reserves dwindled and demand grew, the NCR began printing more money than it could support. Inflation followed, and confidence in the NCR dollar weakened. Bartering and caps, once dismissed as primitive, made a quiet return in frontier settlements. Wealthier cities like the Hub and NCR City clung to the old system, but outside their borders, money was only as valuable as the bullets it could buy. Economists within the Republic warned of collapse, but their voices were often drowned out by senators promising growth. One of the most ambitious undertakings of the Republic was its agricultural revival program. Farmlands reclaimed from the desert became the pride of early propaganda campaigns. Using irrigation systems salvaged from the Old World, the NCR managed to grow wheat, maize, and beans in quantities unseen since before the war. But as the population expanded, demand quickly outpaced supply. Droughts and poor water management strained the system. In some cases, corrupt officials redirected water to profitable plantations owned by political allies, leaving smaller farmers to struggle. Dust storms returned to regions once fertile, and the dream of a self-sustaining republic began to wither. Education became a cornerstone of the republic's ideology. Schools were built in nearly every major settlement, teaching children to read, write, and recite the history of the Republic's founding. The curriculum glorified early leaders like Aradesh and Tandy, presenting them as near mythic figures who rebuilt civilization from chaos. Students learned about the Constitution, about democracy, and about the duty of every citizen to serve the Republic. But critics noted that education often blurred the line between knowledge and propaganda. Textbooks omitted controversial events like the Boneyard riots or the massacres committed during the Mojave Campaign. To outsiders, this was evidence of indoctrination. To the Senate, it was necessary to preserve unity. Despite its flaws, the NCR produced remarkable advances in medicine and technology. Its hospitals, especially those in the Hub and Dayglow, offered treatment to thousands who would have otherwise perished in the wasteland. Pre-war medical techniques were rediscovered, and the Republic's scientists even developed new antibiotics derived from irradiated fungi. Doctors traveled between settlements as part of the Citizen Health Initiative, carrying supplies and spreading medical knowledge. For many, these healers represented the Republic's most human side, the part that still remembered compassion amidst bureaucracy. Yet, shortages of medicine were common, and black markets for stim packs flourished. Even goodwill could not escape corruption. Relations with neighboring regions remained tense. The NCR's western border touched the boneyard, home to independent communities wary of government control. To the north, remnants of raider gangs constantly tested the Republic's defenses, and to the east, the shadow of the Mojave still lingered, its deserts haunted by ghosts of the war with Caesar's legion. Though the legion had fractured after the death of its leader, small war bands persisted, raiding caravans and spreading fear. The NCR responded with force, but every new campaign drained more soldiers and resources. Each victory felt smaller than the cost it demanded. Within the military, morale fluctuated between pride and exhaustion. Veterans from the Mojave campaign often served as instructors for new recruits, passing down lessons written in blood. The Army's structure grew increasingly complex, with specialized divisions handling engineering, logistics, and urban policing, yet corruption spread here too. Officers embezzled supplies, sold weapons to merchants, and inflated reports of success to secure promotions. For every act of heroism, there was another of deceit. Rangers and honest soldiers continued to fight with honor, but the system surrounding them made that fight harder every year. The Republic's Intelligence Division, often referred to simply as the Office, operated in secrecy. Its agents monitored suspected dissenters, infiltrated criminal groups, and kept detailed records on senators and generals alike. Officially, the office existed to protect the Republic from espionage and internal sabotage. Unofficially, it became a tool of political manipulation. Files were leaked to ruin careers or silence critics, and information became a currency more powerful than gold. Citizens whispered that the office knew everything, that no one, not even the president, could act without its eyes watching. Whether true or not, the rumor alone gave it power. Despite its growing authoritarian tendencies, the Republic maintained elections, though their fairness was often questioned. Campaigns became grand spectacles, filled with parades, radio jingles, and carefully staged debates. Candidates promised reforms, but most were funded by the same wealthy interests that kept those reforms from happening. Still, the act of voting mattered to the people. It reminded them that they had a voice, however faint. Even when the system felt rigged, the ritual of democracy persisted, a fragile thread connecting the Republic to the ideals that birthed it. Religion also found new life within NCR borders. While the Republic officially promoted secular governance, spiritual movements flourished. Some citizens turned to remnants of pre-war faiths, rebuilding churches from scrap and preaching hope. Others embraced new philosophies born of the wasteland, combining old world scripture with survivalist wisdom. A popular sect known as the Reclaimers taught that humanity's suffering was a necessary trial to earn redemption. Their followers often volunteered for rebuilding projects and relief efforts, believing they were fulfilling divine purpose. Though harmless at first, the Reclaimers' growing influence began to worry politicians who feared any movement they could not control. In the cultural sphere, art and music blossomed in surprising ways. The Republic's radio stations played a mix of pre-war classics and modern folk songs written by settlers. Painters and sculptors captured the beauty of decay, turning ruined highways and rusted vehicles into symbols of endurance. Writers produced novels and poems celebrating both the triumphs and failures of the Republic, blending nostalgia with criticism. Even in times of hardship, creativity persisted, proving that humanity's need to express itself survived even the apocalypse. As the Republic aged, it began to face questions it could no longer avoid. Could democracy survive in a world that had forgotten what peace felt like? Could ideals of freedom coexist with the demands of security? The Senate debated these questions endlessly, passing resolutions that changed little. Some senators argued that the republic's structure needed reform, reducing central control and empowering local governments. Others demanded stricter oversight and martial law to preserve stability. Each side believed it was saving the republic. Neither realized they were pulling it apart. Throughout all this turmoil, one thing remained constant: the people's belief that tomorrow could be better. No matter how corrupt or divided their government became, citizens continued to plant crops, repair houses, and teach their children about the stars. They joked about taxes and ration lines, but beneath the humor was resilience. The same resilience that had carried humanity through nuclear fire and endless wasteland nights. The NCR might rise or fall, but the will of its people endured. That was its true foundation, stronger than steel or politics. To outsiders, the new California Republic was a paradox. It was both the greatest achievement of the post war world and its most fragile illusion. It embodied civilization and hypocrisy in equal measure. Its soldiers brought law to lawless lands, even as its politicians sold those same lands to the highest bidder. It spoke of unity while fracturing within. Yet, even in its contradictions, the Republic reflected the truth of humanity itself: imperfect, ambitious, and unyielding. Far beyond shady sands, travelers told stories of the Republic's greatness. Merchants described its golden banners fluttering in the wind, its cities alive with laughter and trade. Others told darker tales of starving farmers, corrupt officers, and broken promises. But whether loved or hated, the NCR was never ignored. It remained the heartbeat of the West, flawed yet alive, its echoes spreading across deserts, mountains, and ruins. In the long shadow of history, the new California Republic stood as proof that civilization was not a place or a government. It was an idea that people could choose order over chaos, compassion over cruelty, and hope over despair. That idea may have cracked and faltered, but it never truly died. For every senator who lied, there was a farmer who shared his harvest. For every corrupt general, there was a ranger who stood guard through the night. And for every broken promise, there was a child reciting the Republic's creed in a classroom somewhere, believing in it all over again. The wasteland has a way of erasing everything: cities, nations, and memories. But somehow, the new California Republic refused to vanish. It lingered like the distant light of a fading star, shining not because it was perfect, but because it refused to surrender. And as long as that light glowed, however dimly, the dream of rebuilding the world endured. The later decades of the new California Republic were defined by tension between progress and decay. On paper, the Republic had achieved everything its founders dreamed of. It had a standing army, a working economy, functioning schools, trade routes stretching from the coast to the Mojave, and even ambassadors sent to distant lands. Yet under the surface, cracks widened. The wasteland's harshness was not something that could be legislated away. Every victory came with a cost, and the weight of maintaining civilization began to grind down the very people who had built it. The NCR had grown too large for its own good, and the ideals that once united its people were slowly giving way to bureaucracy, greed, and fatigue. The Republic's political system, modeled after the pre-war United States, consisted of three branches: the executive led by the president, the legislative formed by the bicameral Congress, and the judicial, represented by the courts. In its early years, this system worked relatively well because the population was small and the government could still respond to local needs. But as settlements multiplied and distances expanded, communication faltered. Laws written in shady sands rarely accounted for the realities of distant frontiers. Judges appointed in the capital sometimes never even visited the regions they were supposed to oversee. Petitions for justice could take months to reach the capital, by which time the problem had already resolved itself, often through violence. This disconnect bred resentment. Many frontier citizens began to view the NCR government not as a protector, but as a distant authority, demanding taxes and obedience. One of the most significant internal conflicts arose from the growing influence of corporations. Companies that had started as humble trading outfits became powerful enough to shape policy. The Crimson Caravan, the Gunrunners, and the Fargo Traders were among the largest. They funded senators, controlled supply chains, and dictated the flow of goods across the Republic. In exchange for favorable trade laws, they provided the government with vital infrastructure such as caravans, manufacturing, and transportation. But this alliance came at the expense of smaller settlements. Prices rose, monopolies formed, and those who could not afford the costs found themselves forced to migrate or resort to black market dealings. The government's reliance on corporate backing slowly eroded public trust. The Republic's bureaucracy expanded into a labyrinth of ministries and offices. Departments of agriculture, commerce, defense, and energy employed tens of thousands of civil servants, each generating mountains of paperwork. Citizens often joked that it was easier to cross the Mojave on foot than to file a complaint in shady sands. Corruption became so commonplace that bribes were often seen as the only reliable way to get anything done. Despite periodic anti-corruption campaigns, little changed. Every administration promised reform, yet every one of them became entangled in the same inefficiency that plagued their predecessors. The dream of democracy persisted, but it was a democracy weighed down by its own machinery. Militarily, the Republic was stretched thin. At its height, it maintained multiple divisions across the Mojave, the Boneyard, and the borders near the hub in San Francisco. Rangers continued to serve as elite scouts and peacekeepers, often idolized by citizens who saw them as the last bastion of honor in a corrupt system. Their reputation for integrity and self-sacrifice made them heroes of countless songs and stories. Yet even the Rangers were not immune to the Republic's overreach. Their numbers were too few to patrol every road, and they often had to make impossible choices, protecting one town at the cost of abandoning another. In many cases, Rangers acted independently of orders, choosing morality over protocol. This earned them admiration from the people, but suspicion from their superiors, who saw them as unpredictable. The Republic's military campaigns continued long after the Mojave conflict, though none achieved the same notoriety. In the north, skirmishes with raider clans and mutant enclaves drained resources without producing lasting security. Along the southern frontier, expeditions into Baja California met fierce resistance from local warlords and environmental hazards. The further the NCR expanded, the more it resembled the old world empires it once condemned. Soldiers fought and died not for survival but for territory, often without understanding why. Veterans returned home to find their pensions delayed, their farms seized for unpaid taxes, and their sacrifices forgotten. Disillusionment spread quietly through the ranks, a whisper that the Republic had lost its purpose. Environmental degradation also became a growing crisis. The NCR's agricultural policies, while successful in the short term, had long term consequences. Overuse of irrigation drained underground aquifers, while poor crop rotation led to soil exhaustion. Towns once surrounded by fertile fields turned barren within a generation. Water wars erupted between farmers, settlements, and corporations. The new California Water Authority, formed to regulate resources, became one of the most powerful institutions in the Republic. Its inspectors could shut down entire farms, redirect rivers, or seize wells. For ordinary citizens, water became a political weapon, something controlled by distant bureaucrats rather than the land itself. Even religion and philosophy began to fracture the Republic's unity. While some citizens clung to faith in the old institutions, others turned to new movements that challenged the state's authority. The Church of the Children of the Atom spread from the east, preaching salvation through radiation. Though dismissed as a cult by the Senate, its followers grew steadily in number, particularly among the poor and desperate. The Reclaimers continued to promote a more optimistic vision, focusing on rebuilding and cooperation, while others adopted cynicism as a way of life. The wasteland's hardships blurred the lines between belief and survival, and faith became another frontier of conflict. Culturally, the NCR began to resemble the societies that had perished in the Great War. The wealthy lived in fortified cities with electricity, purified water, and entertainment, while the poor struggled in settlements built from scrap and memory. Radio stations filled the airwaves with cheerful propaganda, promising prosperity that few ever saw. Newspapers printed stories about new construction projects and successful trade agreements, but they rarely mentioned the hunger, disease, and banditry outside city limits. The illusion of stability was carefully maintained, even as the foundation beneath it eroded. Despite these problems, innovation persisted. Inventors rediscovered ways to restore old world technology. Solar farms near Dayglow provided renewable energy, while pre war data archives, salvaged by scientists, helped rebuild lost knowledge. The NCR's universities trained engineers, doctors, and historians who continued to push the boundaries of what was possible. They dreamed of restoring flight, curing radiation sickness, and even rebuilding the old interstate rail systems. But every breakthrough faced the same obstacle: lack of funding. The Senate's budget was consumed by the military and corporate subsidies, leaving little for science. Many researchers emigrated to independent settlements or the Brotherhood of Steel, where their work was more respected. Diplomatic relations with other powers were uneasy. To the north, remnants of the old enclave occasionally resurfaced, claiming legitimacy as the true heirs of America. To the east, isolated communities from the former Legion territories resisted any NCR involvement. Rumors of new settlements forming beyond the Colorado River reached the Senate, sparking both interest and fear. The Republic's spies and scouts gathered what intelligence they could, but much of it was contradictory. Some reports spoke of democratic enclaves, others of bandit kingdoms or emerging warlords. For every potential ally, there was another threat waiting to test the Republic's resolve. The NCR's cultural memory of the Mojave Campaign remained deeply ingrained. Veterans' memorials dotted the capital, and every year the Republic held ceremonies to honor the fallen. Yet the official story often ignored the failures, the mismanagement, the supply shortages, and the arrogance that led to defeat at Hoover Dam. Those who spoke of these truths were labeled unpatriotic. Still, in private, Many citizens whispered that the Mojave had been the Republic's turning point. It was the moment when ambition outgrew reality. After that war, no one could deny that the Republic was still human, capable of greatness, but also of error. The Mojave itself remained a sore subject. Though nominally under NCR influence, it was effectively independent after the conflict. Trade continued between the regions, but mutual distrust persisted. Merchants still carried NCR goods into New Vegas, while caravans from the Strip brought luxury items westward. The Republic saw economic opportunity, while the Mojave saw an empire that had once tried to claim it. Over time, these grudges softened into grudging cooperation, but the wounds never fully healed. The NCR learned a painful lesson about overreach. Within the Senate, power continued to shift between factions. Reformists called for decentralization, arguing that local governors should have greater autonomy. Traditionalists insisted that unity was strength, warning that division would lead to chaos. Populists appealed to citizens' frustrations, blaming corruption on outsiders or imagined conspiracies. Elections became increasingly volatile, with results sometimes contested for years. The slow erosion of trust in government turned apathy into the Republic's greatest enemy. People still voted, but fewer believed their vote mattered. Even as disillusionment spread, the Republic retained moments of triumph. Reconstruction projects in the Boneyard and Hub succeeded in transforming ruins into functional cities. Trade with coastal settlements brought access to fishing and limited maritime travel. Engineers managed to restore parts of the old Los Angeles aqueduct, ensuring cleaner water for millions. Each achievement rekindled a spark of hope, reminding citizens that progress was still possible. These moments of light kept the Republic alive, even as shadows gathered. The arts continued to serve as the voice of conscience for the people. Writers produced plays and pamphlets criticizing corruption while disguised as patriotic tales. Musicians composed ballads about soldiers lost in the Mojave or farmers struggling to feed their families. Painters depicted the contrast between polished cities and barren wastelands, capturing the Republic's contradictions in vivid strokes. Though some works were censored, others spread quietly through caravans and radio broadcasts, keeping dissent alive. In this way, art became the Republic's mirror, reflecting both its ideals and its failings. The question of succession also haunted the NCR. Presidents served fixed terms, but the process of electing new leaders grew more chaotic over time. Allegations of bribery and manipulation became common. Some presidents rose to power through charisma and reformist promises, only to find themselves trapped by the same bureaucracy they vowed to dismantle. A few were genuinely virtuous, remembered for rebuilding towns or cutting corruption. Others faded into history, their legacies forgotten amid endless paperwork and policy debates. Leadership changed, but the system remained the same. As the Republic's borders stabilized, it began to focus inward again. Programs to preserve history gained popularity, with museums dedicated to the pre-war era and the founding of the NCR. These institutions collected artifacts, old world books, and holotapes, preserving the fragile remnants of knowledge. Archaeologists unearthed buried vaults and cities, carefully cataloging their discoveries. For a moment, it seemed the Republic might rediscover not just its past, but its purpose. But as with many of its efforts, funding was inconsistent, and political interest shifted elsewhere. Through all its trials, the NCR never fully lost sight of its guiding principle, the belief that humanity could rebuild. Even its harshest critics admitted that it had achieved more than any other post war society. Where others built kingdoms or cults, the Republic built infrastructure, education, and law. Its soldiers may have been weary, its politicians corrupt, but its citizens still clung to the hope that someday their children would live in a world without fear. That hope was the true currency of the NCR, more valuable than water, gold, or territory. In the wasteland, history has a way of repeating itself. The Republic's expansion mirrored the rise and fall of the nations that came before it, each repeating the same mistakes in different forms. Yet every time humanity rebuilt, it did so with a little more understanding, a little more humility. The NCR's story was not one of perfection, but of persistence. For all its corruption and failure, it stood as proof that even in the ruins of civilization, the human spirit refused to yield. And so the new California Republic endured, tattered, weary, and imperfect, but alive. It remained a beacon, not because it was pure, but because it dared to exist in a world that had forgotten what civilization meant. The wasteland could devour cities and erase histories, but as long as a single banner still fluttered in the wind, as long as someone still believed in the promise of rebuilding, the Republic's legacy would survive. In the quiet decades that followed the height of the Mojave conflict, the new California Republic began to transform once again. Its banners still flew proudly, its citizens still saluted the bear, and its senators still filled the Capitol's marble halls with long speeches about prosperity and progress. Yet outside those walls, the wasteland told a different story. What had once been a growing beacon of civilization was now caught in a slow, uneasy struggle between preservation and decline. The Republic had become a mirror of humanity's nature, resilient, ambitious, and endlessly conflicted. Though weakened by years of corruption and expansion, the NCR remained the largest organized power in post war America. Its borders encompassed hundreds of settlements, from the green valleys near the coast to the barren dunes of the Mojave. Caravans still traveled along cracked highways, their wagons bearing the Republic's seal as both a promise and a warning. The Senate continued to debate taxes and treaties, and newspapers in Shady Sands still published headlines proclaiming the success of new trade routes or reconstruction efforts. But beneath the surface, whispers grew louder rumors that the Republic's strength was an illusion, its unity held together not by trust, but by habit. The Republic's leadership changed hands several times during this era, with each new president inheriting a system that no longer fully obeyed its own rules. Some leaders sought to reform it, focusing on rebuilding the infrastructure that had fallen into disrepair. They repaired roads, reestablished ranger patrols, and reduced military spending. For a time, it seemed as though recovery was possible, but these efforts often collapsed under political resistance or financial strain. The bureaucracy was too entrenched, too layered with competing interests. Every reform created new offices, new regulations, and new ways for corruption to thrive. As the Republic's central government weakened, local governors and generals grew more powerful. In border regions, many effectively ruled as independent authorities, answering to Shady Sands in name only. Some used their positions to protect their people, maintaining order and fair trade. Others became tyrants, enriching themselves at the expense of the settlers they claimed to serve. The Senate tried to rein them in with legislation and audits, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. The Republic's reach had grown beyond what it could hold, and what was once unity had slowly fragmented into a network of loosely connected states, all wearing the same symbol but marching to different drums. Despite its internal struggles, the NCR's influence continued to shape the wasteland. Many independent settlements adopted its laws, trade standards, and educational systems, even if they did not formally join. In some ways, the Republic's greatest achievement was cultural rather than political. Its values, democracy, education, trade, and the rule of law spread far beyond its borders. Travelers who had never set foot in Shady Sands still quoted Tandy's speeches, still painted the two-headed bear on their walls as a sign of hope. Even where the Republic's army no longer marched, its ideals endured. It was a ghost empire, still shaping the world long after its power had faded. The Rangers remained the most respected force within and beyond the Republic. Though their numbers dwindled, their legend grew. They became mythic figures in the eyes of settlers, lonely guardians of justice, wandering the wasteland to protect those forgotten by the government. Many Rangers rejected the rigid hierarchy of the NCR military, choosing to act on their own moral codes. Some operated as mediators between rival settlements, others hunted raiders and mutants along abandoned highways. A few even turned against corrupt officials, believing that their duty to the people outweighed their duty to the state. Among wastelanders, there was an old saying, "When all else fails, the ranger still stands." Within Shady Sands, daily life carried on much as it always had. Citizens went to work, traded goods, attended markets, and discussed politics in crowded taverns. The capital had grown into a sprawling metropolis, surrounded by walls of reinforced concrete and guarded day and night. Electricity powered streetlights and radio towers, though frequent blackouts reminded everyone that progress was fragile. Statues of past presidents stood in public squares, their stone faces weathered but proud. Tourists from distant towns still came to see the Senate chamber where the Republic's first laws had been signed. Yet even there, the atmosphere had changed. Hope had once filled those halls. Now it was replaced by routine. The Republic's military was no longer the disciplined force it had once been. Years of war and overextension had left it exhausted. Recruitment slowed as young citizens grew tired of endless campaigns that promised little reward. Desertion increased, and equipment shortages became common. Many garrisons were manned by half-trained conscripts with outdated weapons. Corruption among officers deepened the problem. Supplies were sold on the black market, and promotions were often bought rather than earned. Yet, despite its decline, the army remained a formidable power compared to most wasteland militias. Raiders and warlords still feared the NCR's flag, even if the soldiers beneath it were weary. Trade, the lifeblood of the Republic, began to shift in unexpected ways. As traditional caravan routes became more dangerous, smaller independent traders took their place, using stealth and local connections rather than military escorts. These merchants often ignored NCR taxes, smuggling goods across borders and selling directly to frontier towns. The Senate condemned this as economic sabotage, but in truth, it kept the wasteland alive. Without these gray markets, many remote settlements would have starved. Over time, these independent networks became the true arteries of the post-war economy, more flexible and honest than the bloated trade ministries that tried to control them. Technology continued to advance, though unevenly. Scientists in Dayglow and the Boneyard developed new forms of energy storage and communication. Experiments with pre-war robotics led to the creation of simple labor automatons, which were used to repair infrastructure and assist in farming. Yet these innovations rarely reached the frontier. Bureaucratic restrictions, patent laws, and logistical issues meant that the best technology remained concentrated in the core cities. The result was a widening technological divide between urban and rural citizens, one that mirrored the gap between rich and poor. Culturally, the NCR began to reflect the duality of the wasteland it ruled. Its citizens celebrated festivals, honoring both pre war holidays and newly invented traditions. One popular event was Republic Day, held annually to commemorate the signing of the first Constitution. Towns decorated with faded red and gold banners, and parades filled the streets with soldiers, farmers, and rangers marching side by side. Children carried paper flags, while vendors sold roasted corn and purified water, mixed with a hint of fruit syrup, a luxury few could afford. For a brief moment each year, unity returned not through policy or law, but through shared memory. Meanwhile, the Republic's historians worked tirelessly to document its past. Libraries in the capital stored everything from early diaries of settlers to military logs from the Mojave Campaign. Scholars debated over the legacy of Tandy, Aradesh, and President Kimball, arguing whether they had been visionaries or idealists blinded by ambition. These debates were not merely academic, they reflected the Republic's own struggle to define itself. To understand its heroes was to understand its future. For a society built on memory, history was both a weapon and a shield. The NCR's relationship with the Brotherhood of Steel remained uneasy. Though open warfare had ended decades earlier, the two factions never fully reconciled. The Brotherhood's secrecy and technological hoarding continued to clash with the Republic's ideals of shared progress. Occasional skirmishes still erupted when NCR patrols crossed forbidden territories or confiscated recovered technology. Yet there were rare moments of cooperation, especially when mutant threats or rogue AIs endangered both sides. These fragile alliances never lasted, but they hinted at what might have been possible if mistrust had not defined their history. As generations passed, the founding myths of the Republic began to fade from living memory. Children in schools still learned about Shady Sands and the first Constitution, but few truly understood the sacrifices that had made them possible. To them, the Republic was simply the world, as it existed, a vast, imperfect system that had always been there. This complacency worried the few remaining idealists who still believed in reform. Without understanding its origins, they argued, the Republic risked losing its soul. But in a world still scarred by radiation and scarcity, philosophy often took second place to survival. Disasters struck occasionally, reminding everyone how fragile civilization remained. Earthquakes toppled buildings, droughts ravaged crops, and raider uprisings swept through the outer provinces. In one infamous incident, a dam collapse flooded an entire valley, destroying several towns and killing thousands. Investigations revealed years of neglected maintenance and falsified reports by officials seeking to save money. The tragedy became a symbol of the Republic's corruption, a natural disaster made worse by human failure. Yet even then, citizens came together to rebuild. Volunteers traveled hundreds of miles to deliver food and supplies. For a time, unity returned in the face of loss. Over time, whispers of reform began to grow louder again. Younger senators and journalists called for transparency, term limits, and decentralization of power. They cited the early days of the Republic, when leaders lived among the people rather than above them. These reformers faced fierce opposition from entrenched elites, but their movement continued to grow. They published pamphlets and gave speeches calling for a return to Tandy's vision, a government that served, not ruled. Whether they succeeded or not was uncertain, but their persistence gave hope that the Republic's flame, though dim, still burned. The Republic's culture evolved in strange and beautiful ways. Music mixed the melancholy of the old world with the optimism of the new. Songs about dust, rain, and memory echoed through taverns and radio broadcasts. Artists painted landscapes where ruined highways met blooming fields, capturing both despair and rebirth. Poets wrote of soldiers, farmers, and rangers, each representing a fragment of humanity's struggle. Even in decay, art flourished. It became the Republic's quiet heartbeat, a reminder that civilization was more than politics. It was the act of remembering what it meant to be human. And through it all, the NCR endured. It was no longer the shining republic that Tandy had built, nor the unstoppable army that marched into the Mojave. It was something older, humbler, but still alive. The wasteland had tested it, broken it, and rebuilt it countless times, yet somehow it continued to stand. Its strength lay not in its flags or its armies, but in its people, those who planted crops in radioactive soil, who taught their children to read, who believed that the past could still guide the future. The Republic was their story, written across generations in sweat, struggle, and stubborn hope. In the end, the new California Republic was not a government, nor a nation, nor a name carved into stone. It was a promise, a fragile, flickering belief that humanity could learn, adapt, and endure. Empires may rise and fall, flags may fade, but that promise would outlast them all. Somewhere, beyond the dust and ruin, someone would still whisper its name and remember what it stood for. And that, more than anything, was enough to keep the dream alive. By the time another century began to pass over the wasteland, the new California Republic had become something between legend and reality. For those born in the heartlands near Shady Sands, it was still a functioning country with governors, courts, and trade routes. For those living on the far edges, it had turned into more of a rumor, a distant authority that demanded taxes but rarely sent help. Yet even in its weakest years, the Republic refused to vanish. Its flags still flew from old rooftops, its coins still changed hands, and its laws, though ignored in many places, still shaped the behavior of millions. It was a ghost of the old world walking among the ruins of the new one, never quite alive but never truly dead. The wasteland's harshness ensured that survival was always the Republic's greatest challenge. Sandstorms tore through highways, mutating radiation continued to poison rivers, and raider groups evolved into small armies equipped with scavenged energy weapons. In some regions, giant mutated wildlife replaced human bandits as the dominant threat. Farmers fortified their lands with scrap metal fences, traders hired mercenary escorts, and small militias became essential for defense. Yet even amid all of this danger, the Republic's people adapted. They built communities around old world wind turbines, used recycled solar panels to power homes, and turned broken pre-war cars into plows and water pumps. The ingenuity that once defined early settlers endured through every generation. Trade remained the glue that held the Republic together. Caravans continued to traverse the broken highways, carrying grain, scrap, and purified water. The traders who survived became legends in their own right, half merchants, half explorers, navigating the dangers of a land that refused to stay still. Many adopted the Ranger's code, treating their work as a calling rather than a profession. Their routes connected the isolated dots of civilization, forming invisible lifelines that stretched across deserts and mountains. It was said that the Republic's roads were its veins and the caravans its blood, circulating hope and necessity in equal measure. In the capital, Shady Sands had grown beyond recognition. What had once been a small farming town was now a sprawling city surrounded by walls of steel and reinforced concrete. Its skyline glimmered faintly with electric lights powered by a mix of solar and fission generators. Though grandeur was scarce, order remained. Markets buzzed with trade, schools still taught children, and the Senate still met in its domed chamber to argue over policy. On the surface, it looked like stability, but underneath was a quiet exhaustion. Every generation of politicians promised to restore the Republic's golden age, yet none ever managed to recapture it. The people had learned to live with disappointment because even a broken republic was better than no republic at all. Technology's slow rebirth offered glimpses of what the NCR might one day become again. Engineers restored old satellites, allowing limited long range communication between cities. This network, though fragile, reconnected communities that had been isolated for decades. Scientists working in the boneyard managed to revive parts of the pre war education archives, uploading digital libraries filled with blueprints, literature, and medical data. For the first time in over 200 years, the Republic had access to knowledge beyond its own memory. Yet, progress always came at a price. The more technology it recovered, the more the NCR's enemies sought to claim or sabotage it. Raiders targeted data centers, and power hungry governors hoarded knowledge to maintain control. Even the tools meant to unite people became sources of division. The Rangers, fewer than ever but still revered, adapted to this new world. They became the silent bridge between the Republic's past and its uncertain future. Without official funding, many operated independently, supported by donations or personal savings. They maintained outposts in forgotten corners, offering help to travelers, repairing radios, and delivering news to distant towns. In some areas, the sight of a ranger's coat brought more comfort than the arrival of an entire NCR regiment. They no longer served the government, they served the people directly. It was an unspoken return to their original purpose, and perhaps that was why their legend endured when so much else had faded. Religion took on a quieter, more personal role in these years. Large organized sects dwindled, replaced by small local congregations that mixed fragments of old beliefs with new philosophies. Some worshipped the pre war world as a fallen Eden, others saw radiation as divine cleansing, and some simply prayed for rain. In the Republic's heartlands, a belief emerged known as the doctrine of renewal. It taught that every generation carried both the duty and the burden of rebuilding, and that true progress was not measured in power, but in endurance. Sermons delivered under broken domes and over flickering radios reminded citizens that rebuilding was not a single act, but a lifelong promise. Art and storytelling continued to thrive, perhaps because they required so little to exist. Wandering performers traveled between settlements, singing songs about the heroes and failures of the Republic. One ballad told of a ranger who crossed the desert with no weapon but his voice, negotiating peace between warring towns through stories of their shared history. Painters carved murals into concrete walls, mixing rust and dust to create color. Writers documented the everyday struggles of farmers and soldiers, their words bound into handmade books traded across the wasteland. In a world where so much had been lost, art became the Republic's memory, holding on to what the wind could not erase. The economy of the NCR evolved into a strange blend of order and improvisation. Official currency still existed, but inflation had long rendered it unreliable. Instead, most trade was conducted through caps, barter, or local credit systems based on trust. In some regions, communities even issued their own coins stamped with the bear emblem, a quiet rebellion that the Senate tolerated because it could not afford to enforce otherwise. Yet, despite this economic fragmentation, commerce thrived. Traders found ways to adapt, and markets continued to hum with life. Survival in the Republic was rarely easy, but it was always possible, and that was more than could be said for most of the wasteland. One of the most significant events of this later era was the rediscovery of Vault 22. Long abandoned and overgrown, the vault's hydroponic systems contained plant strains capable of thriving in irradiated soil. A team of NCR scientists salvaged samples and used them to begin a new agricultural initiative. Within years, small pockets of green began to reappear in regions that had once been barren. The program was hailed as the Republic's second rebirth, though many knew better than to call it salvation. It would take decades to fully restore the land, and droughts continued to plague the Republic, but it was a sign that life could still win against desolation. The NCR's relationship with the remnants of other factions remained uneasy but pragmatic. The Brotherhood of Steel, now reduced to isolated chapters, occasionally traded technological expertise in exchange for protection or resources. Former members of Caesar's Legion, scattered and broken, sometimes integrated into NCR settlements, though their presence often reignited old hatred. Even Enclave descendants, long thought extinct, resurfaced as small communities seeking peace under the Republic's laws. What had once been enemies became reluctant neighbors. The wasteland had taught everyone that survival required compromise. Civic reformers slowly gained momentum within the Senate, their ideas spreading through universities and radio broadcasts. They argued that the Republic could not sustain itself without returning to its original principles: local representation, community based decision making, and limited central power. These reformers drew inspiration from the early writings of Tandy and Aradesh, reminding citizens that the Republic had begun not as a government, but as a collective of survivors. Slowly, their philosophy began to shape policy. Taxes were reduced in rural areas, new elections were held for regional councils, and the army was scaled back to prioritize defense over conquest. The Republic was not reborn, but it was rediscovering itself piece by piece. One of the most touching transformations occurred within the NCR's education system. In small schools rebuilt from old world ruins, teachers began to teach history not as propaganda, but as reflection. Children learned about the Republic's triumphs and its mistakes alike. They studied the wars with the Brotherhood, the campaign at Hoover Dam, and the years of corruption that nearly tore the nation apart. The goal was no longer blind pride, but honest understanding. These young citizens grew up with a clearer sense of what their country truly was: a collection of flawed but determined people trying to keep the light alive in a world of shadows. In remote areas, archaeologists continued to uncover pre war ruins, preserving fragments of humanity's forgotten age. Some of these sites became pilgrimage destinations, places where citizens could see for themselves what civilization had once achieved and lost. One such discovery was an ancient observatory still intact enough for use. There, scholars reassembled telescopes and, for the first time in centuries, recorded data on the stars. It was a humbling reminder that despite everything, humanity still looked upward. The wasteland might be broken, but the sky remained infinite. By this point, The Republic's flag had taken on a life of its own. The two-headed bear had become more than a symbol of government. It was a symbol of endurance. Each settlement flew a slightly different version, some hand-painted, some stitched from scraps of fabric. In the frontier towns, one head of the bear was sometimes replaced by a star, representing independence within unity. The Senate tolerated these variations, understanding that symbols mattered more than uniformity. In the wasteland, where borders and rulers changed like the wind, the bear remained the one constant, an old dream that refused to die. Though the NCR's military had long since ceased to dominate the West, it still performed vital work. Patrols protected trade routes, helped maintain order, and assisted in disaster recovery. The Army's recruitment drives focused less on patriotism and more on service, rebuild, protect, endure, became the new slogan printed on recruitment posters. Many recruits were not soldiers by nature, but farmers, engineers, or medics who saw service as a chance to contribute. For them, the uniform was not a symbol of power, but of responsibility. This quiet humility marked a shift in the Republic's culture, a recognition that heroism was not found in conquest, but in endurance. The Senate itself had changed in tone. Gone were the fiery speeches about expansion and dominance. Instead, debates centered on sustainability, infrastructure, and preservation. It was no longer about reclaiming the world, but maintaining what little remained. Some lamented this shift, seeing it as proof that the Republic had grown old and timid, but others saw it as wisdom hard earned. The wasteland did not reward pride, it rewarded patience. And in that patience, the Republic found its new identity, not as conqueror, but as caretaker. The Rangers' final legacy was perhaps the most profound. As their numbers dwindled, their teachings became formalized into a philosophy known as the Long Watch. It taught that every act of kindness, no matter how small, helped keep civilization alive. The last known ranger outpost, hidden deep in the mountains, became a place of pilgrimage for travelers seeking purpose. They left offerings of bullets, books, or simply stories. No one knew who still lived there, if anyone did at all, but the fires that burned on the ridgeline every night told people that the watch continued. Even in silence, the Rangers still guarded the Republic. And so, through endless hardship and fading glory, the new California Republic endured into yet another age. Its laws shifted, its leaders changed, and its people aged and rebuilt 1,000 times over. But the essence remained the will to keep trying, no matter how many times the world ended. In a land where every ruin told a story of failure, the Republic's story was one of persistence. It may never reclaim the power it once had, but perhaps it no longer needed to. Survival itself had become its greatest victory. Beneath the cracked concrete of its cities and the dust of its forgotten highways, the Republic's heartbeat continued to echo, a promise whispered from one generation to the next that even when the world burned, humanity would rise again. And in that quiet endurance, in that unbroken will to rebuild, the true spirit of the wasteland lived on. Time has a way of turning nations into myths, and by the later years of the new California Republic, the line between legend and history had all but disappeared. For some, the Republic was still a functioning nation, with laws, senators, and schools. For others, it was a memory held together by stories passed down around campfires. Its cities still stood, though many were smaller than their names suggested. Its armies still marched, though fewer soldiers answered the call each year. Yet, even as its strength faded, the Republic's idea endured the belief that humanity could rebuild something better than what came before. In the heartlands, Where Shady Sands and the Hub had once been vibrant centers of life, the air now carried a quiet stillness. The golden fields that once fed millions had begun to recede under decades of drought. Irrigation lines cracked, and the pumps that had once drawn water from deep aquifers began to run dry. The farmers, descendants of those who had founded the Republic's first settlements, adapted in their own ways. Some turned to desert crops that could survive the heat. Others left for northern territories where rainfall was more forgiving. Whole towns migrated in slow caravans, pulling their homes behind Brahmin carts, searching for rivers that still flowed. It was a quiet exodus, not driven by war but by exhaustion. In Shady Sands, the Senate continued to function, though its chamber often stood half empty. Senators representing ghost towns still held seats, even when their constituents had long since moved away. Debates dragged on for days over matters that seemed almost ceremonial, ratifying trade agreements with regions that no longer existed, approving budgets for patrols that had no soldiers left to carry them out. Yet, even in this bureaucratic decay, there remained a strange dignity. The Republic kept its rituals because they reminded its people that civilization was still possible, even if only in form. The sound of the gavel striking wood was a heartbeat that refused to stop. The NCR's population, once one of the largest in the post-war world, began to decline. Disease, famine, and migration took their toll. The young grew restless, uninterested in the old ideals that had sustained their grandparents. Many left the Republic's borders to seek their own fortunes in distant lands, establishing new settlements that would one day become stories themselves. But others stayed, determined to hold on to what remained. They tended the farms, guarded the roads, and repaired the old machines that kept their communities alive. The Republic was no longer a nation of expansion, it had become a nation of caretakers, holding on to memory as tightly as they held on to life. In the Western Territories, the coastlines had begun to shift again. The ocean crept inward, flooding parts of old cities and swallowing the remains of pre-war ports. Fishermen adapted by building floating markets out of scrap wood and steel, where boats from dozens of settlements gathered to trade. These markets became symbols of resilience, tiny moving cities of barter and laughter amid the ruins of the old world. The NCR taxed them when it could, though enforcement was sporadic. In truth, the Senate was content to let them thrive. So long as goods flowed, civilization lived. The Republic's military now existed mostly in name. Its divisions were spread thin, and many outposts had long since become self-sufficient communities. Soldiers who stayed at their posts often took on the role of peacekeepers, teachers, and farmers rather than warriors. Their uniforms faded to pale brown, their flags tattered by wind and Sunday. Yet they carried themselves with the quiet pride of those who remembered what their service once meant. The great battles were long over. Now the fight was against decay itself. Rangers remained scattered across the wasteland, their once proud ranks now little more than a handful of survivors, yet their legacy had outgrown their numbers. Entire settlements taught the Rangers' code to their children, passing it down like scripture. Protect the weak, tell the truth, serve no master but justice. Those words became as much a part of the wasteland's culture as the Republic's constitution itself. It was said that even in regions where the NCR no longer existed, travelers could find symbols of the bear carved into stone or painted on walls, marking safe places where rangers had once walked. The Republic's economy had shifted into a strange rhythm of self-reliance and trade with outsiders. Caps and barter once again replaced the NCR dollar, which had long since become more sentimental than valuable. Cities like the Hub turned into massive bazaars, where merchants from every corner of the wasteland gathered. There were traders from the east, travelers from beyond the mountains, and even scavengers from the far north. The NCR's influence lingered in the form of its laws, contracts, weights, and measures that made trade possible even when nations failed. Though the Republic's government weakened, its institutions continued to shape how people interacted, as if civilization itself remembered the patterns it had once followed. The new California Rangers' final generation became something closer to philosophers than soldiers. They trained apprentices not in combat, but in mediation, teaching them to resolve disputes before they turned violent. Their camps became schools where travelers could learn first aid, survival, and negotiation. A few of these camps eventually grew into permanent settlements, forming small circles of peace in a wasteland that had known little of it. In this way, the Rangers outlived their own government, not through strength, but through kindness. Shady Sands itself changed more than any other city. Though it still called itself the capital, its population had dwindled, and parts of it were reclaimed by nature. Vines climbed the walls of old government buildings, and the air smelled faintly of dust and oil. The presidential office, once the heart of power, now functioned more as a museum. Visitors came to see the desk where Tandy had signed the first Constitution, or the podium where she had given her final address. Some said her ghost still haunted the chamber, watching over the republic she had built. Whether true or not, few entered the room without lowering their voices in respect. In the republic's later years, art and literature became the greatest preservation of its identity. Writers chronicled its rise and fall in sprawling histories written by hand on salvaged paper. Poets wrote about the two-headed bear not as a symbol of power, but of endurance. The bear's twin faces came to represent the dual nature of humanity, its potential for greatness, and its endless tendency toward failure. Songs written in this era spoke not of glory, but of gratitude. They were lullabies for a nation that had given everything it could and now deserved rest. The NCR's final innovations were not machines or weapons, but systems of preservation. Engineers developed long-term storage vaults for data and knowledge, designed to outlast any government or war. They filled these archives with blueprints, maps, books, and even recordings of speeches and songs. The intention was simple: to ensure that if the Republic ever fell, its knowledge would survive for those who came after. These vaults became the Republic's last great project, carried out not for glory, but for legacy. It was said that within one of them, buried deep beneath the earth, was a recording of Tandy's voice saying, "Remember who we were and why we tried." Over time, the wasteland began to shift once more. New nations rose where the NCR's influence had faded. Some followed its example, forming councils and senates of their own. Others rejected it, turning toward tribal systems or merchant guilds. Yet in every corner of the West, the NCR's shadow lingered. Its roads became the foundations of new highways. Its cities became the ruins upon which others built. Its laws and language lived on in the mouths of people who no longer remembered their origin. In a way, the Republic had succeeded beyond what even Tandy could have imagined. It had become part of the wasteland's very fabric. Legends grew around its final days. Some said the Republic eventually collapsed quietly, dissolving into a federation of independent states. Others claimed it endured in some hidden form, its government moving underground to wait for the world to heal. A few believed that the Rangers still roamed, unseen, guiding travelers and watching the stars from mountaintops. Whatever truth existed, it became impossible to separate from myth. The wasteland had always blurred the line between history and story, and perhaps that was fitting. The Republic had begun as both. Even centuries later, the two headed bear continued to appear in unexpected places, engraved on weapons, painted on walls, stitched into clothing. Children who had never heard the name Shady Sands still recognized it as a mark of safety. It became less a symbol of government and more one of perseverance. Wherever the bear stood, so too did the spirit of rebuilding, of trying again after failure. That was the true heart of the Republic, not its borders or armies, but the unyielding belief that humanity was worth saving. In the end, the Republic's story was not one of conquest or collapse, but of continuity. Every civilization leaves behind its echoes, and the NCRs were stronger than most. They existed in the roads that stretched across the desert, in the laws that governed trade, in the languages spoken by travelers who had never seen its capital. It was not perfect, and perhaps it never could have been, but it had tried, and in the wasteland, that alone was enough. Somewhere beyond the ruins, beyond the reach of memory, the wind still carried faint traces of the Republic's anthem, a tune hummed by rangers long gone, by farmers tending dying crops, by children who would never know the world that came before. It was a song of persistence, of light refusing to fade in the dark. And in that song, the new California Republic lived on, not as a government, but as a whisper, soft, steady, and unending,